Hello everyone and welcome to the first webinar in our summer series. In this webinar, we'll be looking at contamination in recycling and ideas to tackle the problem. My name is Harriet Rockcliffe-Nally and I'm a marketing executive at WRAP. And today we have Debbie Slater and Julia Bragg, our recycling and collections advisors, who will be presenting. Firstly, for those of you who don't know us, a quick introduction to WRAP. Our vision is a world in which resources are used sustainably. Our mission is to accelerate the move to a sustainable, resource-efficient economy through reinventing how we design, produce and sell products, rethinking how we use and consume products, and redefining what is possible through reuse and recycling. I'm now going to hand over to Debbie Slater, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Harriet. So just to give you a brief outline of our presentation today, we're firstly going to look at exactly what the problem is with regards to contamination. We'll look at why in fact we have these issues and also some practical solutions for how you might want to go about tackling it. Hopefully we'll provide you with enough evidence and information to allow you to be brave and to make some changes in what may politically be a fairly contentious area. Firstly, we've got a quote from former WRAP Director and current Chief Executive of the Resource Association, Ray Georgeson. He claimed that contamination was a huge issue for British manufacturing and that it was potentially costing over £50 million a year to clean up the materials. We had over 375 people register for our webinar last week, and I think that's just testament to how much of an issue contamination is, and hopefully we'll be able to develop or strengthen your plans to try and tackle the issue today. So in order to consider exactly what the problem is, we've taken some results from our annual Recycling Tracker survey. Just to give you a bit of background, the survey is delivered online to a panel of people and annually we receive around 2,500 responses. It cross-checks people's responses against their postcode and their local collection services, so we can identify if people are recycling the correct items for their area or if in fact they're contaminating or presenting non-target items. You can find the full report on our website and it's a really good source of evidence for building policies or for tackling issues such as contamination. It's also great for helping to develop communication campaigns, so I'd recommend that you have a little look, and we'll also send out a link with this presentation. The tracker provides people with a list of materials and asks them what they did the last time they disposed of those items. So did they put it in their residual bin or their recycling bin? We know from their postcode whether or not they did the correct thing with those items. And here we have a list of items that people frequently claim to have recycled when they're not actually collected by their local authority. There are some things on the list that you may actually collect, such as pots, tubs and trays or beverage cartons, but for some authorities these might be non-target materials, and that accounts for the disparity in the percentages we can see at the bottom there. I'm sure there was a number of items on that previous list that you recognise as common contaminants in your collection, such as plastic bags, bubble wrap and things like drinking glasses and Pyrex. So they're all fairly common items that are frequently presented for recycling and shouldn't be. But the tracker also highlights some serious contaminants that people claim to put in their recycling bin, such as nappies, pet litter, sanitary products and clothing. So although the levels of these items is much smaller, the impact's obviously much greater. We've even heard in some cases that paper merchants have refused to take fibre from suppliers whose loads have been heavily contaminated with nappies. So clearly it's a problem that needs to be addressed. When you first start to look at how you're going to tackle contamination, we'd really recommend that you try and work out just how much contamination is costing your authority. Resource London have put together a cost of contamination toolkit which helps you to look at the true costs. It takes into account things like higher MRF fees, paying for loads to go to energy from waste, the cost of rejected loads, officer time, additional crew and vehicle costs, and also communication costs. It's a really useful tool for helping to build a business case for tackling contamination, and it uses a cost-benefit analysis approach. A number of London boroughs ran tackling contamination projects in 2017, and in completing the toolkit it was found that the annual cost of contamination in some instances was into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. That shows just how important this is as a starting point for any work to tackle the issue of contamination in your authority.
Thank you, Debbie, for taking us through the last few slides. It's Julia Bragg here, and I'm going to be talking to you about why we have this problem. We think it's a lot to do with habit. So instead of eat, sleep, recycle, repeat, we need to change things up. Thinking a little bit more about habit and why we have the problem of householders continuing to put contamination into their bins. Here we've got a householder. She's put out her recycling container ready to be collected. The crews have come along and emptied her container, and so she's brought her bin back in. On the next occasion, she puts her container out and the crews take away the contents and empty the bin for her. And that happens every time she puts her bin out for collection. This point of habit and collections always being made every time a collection is expected is reinforced by local authorities issuing collection calendars, which is helpful for the resident to know when to put their bins out, but does reinforce this point of recycling always being taken away. Here we have our resident. She's popped her bin out again. And she's thinking, well, the recycling is always collected, so I really must be doing it right. No one's ever told me that I'm doing anything wrong. But we know from our recycling tracker survey that 3/4, 76% of households, add one or more items to their recycling that isn't accepted locally. And that's a pretty high figure. In these next few slides, we're going to think about some ways to fix the problem. We're also going to look at some case studies where we've worked in different parts of the country trying to find solutions to the problem of contamination. In 2017 and 18, Resource London started off a Tackling Contamination project. Resource London is a partnership between WRAP and the London Waste and Recycling Board, and I was involved in the project myself. Key to making progress was to properly understand problems on the ground. And to do this, we looked at collections in terms of the frequency, the types of containers and vehicles, and we looked at curbside and flats rounds. We analysed any of the data that we had available, and that was MRF sampling information, rounds data, the number of contamination incidents, and by that I mean the number of tags that crews had actually popped on bins. We looked at the contamination policies that the boroughs had in place and whether these were fit for purpose, whether in part or fully, or in fact whether they got a policy at all. The boroughs compiled some fairly comprehensive workbooks and they gave us a really good insight on the problems that they faced on the ground and to do with their operations. We can make the workbook available to you after this webinar. WRAP also helped Resource London with reviewing the effectiveness of the communication to residents, and that involved looking at the websites, service leaflets, contamination stickers, bin stickers, anything that the borough puts out to residents to help with encouraging recycling. There were a number of issues that we found, and while they were particular to the individual boroughs that we work with, but we know that they're often found for other local authorities. So one of the problems we found was double shifting, and by this we mean that the vehicles have an early and a late shift, and in the morning the recycling was collected. Any contaminated bins were left behind then for the late shift residual crews to empty off. So residents never saw any bins left unemptied because it had always been taken away by the residual crews. In another borough there was a clear all policy, so all bins and all sacks had to be taken off the streets on every collection round. Again, residents never knew that there was a problem with their recycling. In a couple of boroughs, some flats were on the same rounds as curbside properties, and we know that communal bins are hard to tag and residents don't feel the same sense of responsibility to recycle as effectively if they know that their neighbour might be popping things into the bin that they shouldn't be. We had another borough that had very few supervisors to manage the crews and to support them with contamination activities. So there were no checks going on as to what the crews were doing. Our communications review found that the quality and amount of communications to residents really varied, and that was of some concern in certain instances. What was common to all the projects was a really low level of crew engagement, and thus was a really poor enforcement of a contamination policy that a borough might have had in place if a borough has a contamination policy in the first place. In the Tackling Contamination project, we really wanted to get to the nub of this issue, that nothing ever changes, that contamination has become a habit for our residents. What we wanted to trial in the Resource London Tackling Contamination project was, could we break this cycle of eat, sleep, recycle and repeat? Could we provide feedback to residents so that they stopped contaminating and not realising that there was a problem? So in this scenario, the householder puts out a bin, the crew issues a tag on the bin is left unemptied, and then the resident finds the bin, reads the information, and this breaks their contamination habit. Where the problem arose in our Tackling Contamination project was with engaging with the crews to ensure that they consistently applied the contamination policy and issued the tags and left the bins unemptied. And some anecdotal evidence that we've got from a variety of local authorities indicates that less than 1% of bins are left tagged and uncollected on normal collection rounds. So knowing that less than 1% of bins are reported as contaminated by crews, is the thought of crews being actively engaged and taking time to check bins, is it a utopia? And we have got a lovely picture of a beautiful beach. Is that something that we can only dream of? Resource London will soon be starting a project where a third party will go ahead of the crews and check on contamination levels and issue tags and report these back to the depot so that the bins aren't recorded as missed collections. If it's not feasible for you to have a third party to do this checking and tagging, then we suggest that you're much more proactive with your crews. We also need to think about how we feed back to crews. So we know that feedback to residents is important. We've been talking about that in the last few slides. So this is about thinking about feedback to our crews. We've commissioned training over the years, and it's never really had a demonstrable positive impact on contamination rates. And where it did have some effect, that wasn't borne out long term. We know that we need to provide lots of training to crews, particularly about what really is contamination and how much is too much contamination in the bin. So thinking about our feedback and our habit issue, if no one checks if we're doing something right, we assume we are doing it right, or we don't really mind because no one's telling us how to do it right. Can someone else apart from the crews check to see if the bin is contaminated before the crews arrive? So this would be a spot check on some of the bins. In this instance, the supervisor would then compare what they'd found when they were doing their checks on the ground to what's been logged on in-cab devices and by the crews, or on paper if that's what they use. And that would be a comparison done at the end of the round. But this doesn't need to be a negative process. It needs to be supported and engaging. And we would suggest that you're heavily involved in this with the supervisors and with the crews. We know that this third party check or this supervisor check or an officer check really does yield great results, because we've had anecdotal evidence from borough officers that reported that far more bins than normal were reported as contaminated when they were going on rounds with the crews as compared to when they weren't present. We know that crews will probably initially have to tag and log more bins as contaminated initially, but the theory is that by disrupting the habit, householders will change their ways, contaminate their bins much less frequently, so that tags don't need to be issued and crews don't need to spend so much time. So we acknowledge that there'll be some work up front, but that should tail off. What we do suggest, though, is that you have regular spot checks on crew activities over time, so that the bad habits don't creep back into crews and bad habits creep back into householder behaviour.
So using some of the techniques that Julia has talked about in the previous slides can help you to build your process for tackling contamination. But in terms of your wider policy, there's some things that we feel that you really need to take into account. Firstly, you need to make sure that you've got political buy-in. This is crucial. It's important to make sure that you've got support from your politicians, and if you engage with members at an early stage, provide them with evidence around your costs and the benefits of taking action, then this really forms a key part of your planning process. You need to have a transparent and consistent policy in place. This should employ a phased approach of issuing warnings and letters, and it should ultimately lead up to leaving bins unemptied or withdrawing services. Where you're issuing tags or letters, you need to make sure that it's easy to differentiate between the different stages of the process, and would recommend that you involve your legal team in the wording of any letters. Where your services are outsourced, you need to make sure that there's scope within your current collection arrangements to implement your chosen policy methods, and that your crews are really empowered to act. In terms of communications, providing residents with up-to-date service information is key. Our tracker research shows that across all age brackets, people still cite a council leaflet as their main source of information about their waste and recycling collections. And we know from other research that people like to have printed information that they can retain and that they can easily refer to. You need to produce informative tags or stickers that can be applied to contaminated bins. We'd recommend working with your collection crews to develop these, and that really helps to keep them engaged in the process. And the tagging of your bins need to be supported by staged letters. Our partners' website will soon have templates of Recycle Now service leaflets, contamination tags, and bin stickers that you can adapt and localise, and we'll let you know when as soon as those are available. In addition to working closely with your crews, it's crucial to engage your contact centre staff in the process. Make sure that they have knowledge of what contamination is and what the impacts of it are. You'll also need to agree an approach between your collection crews, your back office and your call centre staff for locking out bins that have been reported as contaminated. You need to make sure that where bins are left unemptied, they don't become mixed up amongst your missed bin processes. So you'll need to think about how call centre staff will know if a resident reports a missed bin, whether or not it's actually an uncollected contaminated bin. Your crews are crucial to ensuring that your policy is effectively implemented. So you obviously need to make sure that they are trained and that they know what they need to do when they find contaminated bins. Often when implementing new campaigns, policy or processes, the missing link is data. Being RAP, we love data and we love developing evidence-based solutions, so we can't stress enough just how important it is to make sure that you know if your project is having an impact or not. With regards to contamination, there are lots of data sources you could look at, such as the number of tags you issue, the number of bins not collected, some MRF sampling data, the number of rejected loads, or even waste composition analysis. By recording this information, both pre and post your interventions, you can measure the effectiveness of your crew's actions, and you can also provide them with ongoing feedback and support.
Thank you, Debbie. We're just coming to the end of our webinar now, and our final session is on being brave. Got a little quote here from Robin Sharma, the author. Change is hard at the beginning, messy in the middle and gorgeous at the end. We know that tackling contamination is really hard for local authorities. It's political, it requires a lot of work with your crews, it requires work with the MRF. There's a lot of people involved in this process. And at the beginning of the chain are householders whose behaviours are difficult to adjust. We know that change is hard and we know that change is messy. I can almost hear lots of local authorities saying while they're listening to this webinar, but we've done all this stuff before. To be successful, you really need to know your stuff. What are the specific problems for your local area? And nail down how much contamination costs you, because then you'll know how much cost you're willing to invest to try and solve the problems. We know that lots of local authorities have done leaflets and tags, trained their crews, taken members on tours to see uncollected bins. But honestly, how much do you think residents know or care about contamination when their bins are collected every time? We know that those tagging rates tail off after a while. We can't emphasise how valuable starting small could be. It'll help you with your PR, it'll definitely help with member engagement and to get them feeling comfortable. It can also help with crew learning. You can share ideas after a small project. Also, the costs are much more manageable and you can pick up your own practical tips. And being RAP, we would always urge you to measure and record whatever your costs are, whatever your interventions are, and then you can evaluate the success of your project at the end. A good place to go for more information is the RAP guide, Dry Recyclables, Improving Quality, Cutting Contamination, and that's available on our website. It was published a couple of years ago, but there's a lot of good stuff in there that's still incredibly relevant today.
Okay, so just to finish up, we'd like to remind you that we're all here to help. We're more than happy to respond to individual queries, and this rogues gallery here is the local authority support team, and you're welcome to email any one of us using the email protocol of firstname.lastname@rap.org.uk. Any London boroughs that are listening to this presentation are also welcome to contact Beverly at Resource London, who works on the Tackling Contamination projects with Julia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. We do hope that you found it useful. We had a lot of interesting questions raised during the live webinar, and you can find these on the RAP website. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.